A Navy SEAL returns to claim the old mansion his grandfather left behind, believing it is nothing more than a forgotten inheritance. But on the very first night, his loyal dog begins acting strangely, as if it senses something he cannot yet understand. From a silent, abandoned place, the house slowly becomes a refuge for people and animals searching for hope. And the soldier who thought he was only passing through begins to realize this place might be the very reason he was brought back. Is it just coincidence? Or a plan his grandfather set in motion years ago? Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe to support the channel. Now, let's begin the story. The road north had begun to thaw, though winter still clung to the land like a stubborn memory. Patches of dirty snow lined the shoulders of the highway, melting slowly under a pale sun that never quite warmed the air. Cold wind moved across the open fields and through the dark forests beyond, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. Kalen Ward drove with one hand on the wheel of his aging pickup truck, the other resting loosely against the door. The truck rattled when it hit uneven pavement, but the sound didn't bother him. After years of listening to helicopters, gunfire, and engines screaming across deserts and mountains, a little mechanical noise was nothing. Silence bothered him more. The silence inside a life that no longer had a mission. He was 35 years old, tall just over 6 feet, and built the way soldiers were built after years of carrying too much weight across too many miles. His body was lean and efficient rather than bulky, every movement economical, without effort. His face was clean-shaven, sharp-boned, with a square jaw and high cheekbones that made his expressions seem controlled, even when he wasn't trying. His skin was light, but wind-burned from cold northern air, and his hair dark brown was cut short in the familiar military style, though slightly longer than regulation. The eyes were what most people noticed, gray-blue, steady, and strangely calm. Eyes that had seen too many things, and no longer felt the need to react quickly to anything. Beside him on the passenger seat sat Briggs. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, his thick coat a blend of cream, gray, and black that caught the dim afternoon light like brushed steel. His ears stood upright, alert even when he appeared relaxed, and his amber eyes moved constantly between the road, the passing trees, and Kalen's face. Around his chest was a working harness black with a thin dark red trim worn but sturdy, the handle on top polished from years of use. Briggs had once been trained as a search and rescue working dog alongside military units. Even now, long after those days had ended, he carried himself like he still had a job to do. Kalen reached over and scratched behind the dog's ear. "You're quiet today," he said. Briggs flicked his ear, but didn't look away from the road ahead. The truth was, Kalen had been quiet too. Quieter than usual. 3 hours earlier, a man had walked into the small diner where Kalen sometimes worked odd shifts washing dishes and handed him a thick envelope. That man was Daniel Keats, the family lawyer. Daniel Keats was a tall, thin man somewhere in his early 60s. His gray hair was combed carefully back from a high forehead, and his posture had the careful stiffness of someone who spent most of his life standing in courtrooms rather than forests or fields. His face wasn't unfriendly, but it carried the permanent seriousness of someone accustomed to delivering news that changed lives. He had ordered black coffee, sat down across from Kalen, and placed the envelope on the table between them. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks," he said. His voice was quiet, but precise, the way lawyers spoke when every word had weight. Kalen had wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the envelope. "Bad news usually chases me faster than that," he replied. Daniel Keats gave a faint smile. "Not bad news." He tapped the envelope. "Inheritance." That word had felt foreign the moment it landed on the table. Kalen hadn't had much family left. His father died when he was young. His mother followed not long after. The only person who had ever truly anchored his childhood was his grandfather, an old man who lived in a house somewhere up north near a town called Alder Ridge. But Kalen hadn't seen that place in over 20 years. After high school, he enlisted, then the SEALs, then deployments stacked one after another until the world outside missions became something distant and blurry. He opened the envelope. Inside was a set of documents: property ownership, a letter, and a photograph. Daniel Keats had watched him carefully while he read. "Your grandfather passed away 6 months ago," the lawyer said gently. "He left the property entirely to you." Kalen stared at the words. Alder Vale Manor. The name pulled something loose in the back of his mind, memories buried under years of discipline and distance. The house on the hill, the lake below, a long wooden porch, his grandfather's voice telling stories while the wind came across the water. Daniel Keats leaned back in his chair. "There was one condition," he said. He slid a smaller envelope forward. "He asked that you read this personally." Now that envelope sat on the dashboard of Kalen's truck. He hadn't opened it yet. Briggs suddenly shifted in the seat. The dog leaned forward and sniffed the envelope again, nose brushing the paper with unusual focus. Kalen glanced over. "What is it?" Briggs sniffed again, then gave a low rumble. Not a growl, not a warning, but something thoughtful, almost curious. Kalen frowned. "Smells like old paper, buddy." But Briggs didn't relax. He kept staring at the envelope. Something about the dog's attention made Kalen finally reach for it. The paper felt thin and slightly brittle, like it had been written long before it was mailed. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, written in careful handwriting. His grandfather's handwriting. Kalen read the words once, then again. Then he sat very still. The truck continued rolling along the empty northern highway, while the cold sunlight slid slowly across the dashboard. The letter was short. No dramatic explanations. No sentimental speeches. Just a memory. His grandfather wrote about a summer afternoon long ago. Kalen had been 10 years old, sitting on the steps of Alder Vale Manor with his fishing pole leaning against the railing. The lake had been bright under the sun, the air warm and full of insects and birds. Young Kalen had asked his grandfather what made a man useful. The old man had laughed and asked what Kalen meant. And the boy had answered with the absolute certainty only children possessed. "I want to grow up and be someone who protects people." Later that same evening, the boy said something else. He wanted to be a Navy SEAL. His grandfather had never forgotten that. The last line of the letter read, "If the world ever makes you forget who you were trying to become, come home before you decide what this house is worth." Kalen folded the letter slowly. The truck engine hummed beneath his hands. For several miles, he didn't speak. Suddenly, Briggs lifted his head sharply. The dog's ears snapped forward. Then he turned and looked directly at Kalen, not at the road, not at the trees, but straight into his eyes. It was the look Briggs used during operations when he had detected something before anyone else. But there was nothing around them except empty highway and distant forest. Briggs placed one heavy paw gently on Kalen's leg. The gesture was deliberate, almost insistent. For a strange moment, Kalen felt as if the dog were saying something he couldn't quite hear. The feeling passed quickly, but the silence afterward felt different. Kalen exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "I guess we're going north." Briggs relaxed immediately, as if that had been the only answer he wanted. The road curved through thicker forest now. Tall pines rose on either side, their branches dripping with melting snow. Small streams ran beside the road where ice had begun to crack and flow again. Late winter in northern Minnesota. The world was waking up. Kalen hadn't realized how tired he was until that moment. Not physically. He could still run miles, carry weight, fight if he had to, but tired in a quieter way. Tired of drifting. Tired of waking up without a place that needed him. The pickup climbed a long hill. At the top, the land opened wide, revealing distant lakes and dark forests stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those trees lay Alder Ridge and Alder Vale Manor. Briggs stood up in the seat now, front paws braced against the dashboard, nose pointed forward. "Easy," Kalen said, though he felt a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The dog's tail thumped once. It was the first time all day that either of them seemed certain about where they were going. The sun dipped lower, turning the snow along the roadside into strips of silver light. Kalen drove on. And somewhere deep in his chest, a memory he thought was gone forever stirred quietly awake. The last stretch of road into Alder Ridge curved through tall pine forests that seemed older than memory itself. Snow still clung to the shadows beneath the trees, though the center of the road had begun to thaw into dark ribbons of wet asphalt. The air smelled of cold water and sap, the kind of scent that only came when winter was reluctantly giving ground to spring. Kalen Ward drove slower now. Not because the road demanded it, but because something inside him did. The wooden sign marking Alder Ridge, population 1,142, appeared suddenly between two leaning birch trees. The paint had faded under decades of weather, but someone had recently brushed snow from the letters. Small towns had a habit of maintaining their symbols even when they couldn't afford to maintain much else. Briggs lifted his head as the truck rolled past the sign. The German Shepherd stood up in the passenger seat, paws planted against the door, amber eyes scanning the quiet street ahead. His ears twitched constantly, processing distant sounds, truck engines, a hammer striking wood, wind sliding through power lines. The dog's instincts had always been sharp, but today they seemed almost deliberate. Kalen noticed it. "You remember this place?" he murmured. Briggs didn't answer, of course, but the dog's posture carried a quiet intensity that hadn't been there earlier. The main street of Alder Ridge was short and practical. A gas station, a diner with a faded red roof, a hardware store with a bell over the door, and a narrow brick building that housed the town's library. Old pickup trucks lined the street like loyal animals waiting for their owners. The town looked exactly the way small northern towns always looked in late winter, half asleep, but stubbornly alive. Kalen parked near the hardware store. When he stepped out of the truck, the cold wind cut through his olive tactical shirt immediately. The fabric had softened over years of wear, faded in places where sun and weather had taken their share. Beneath it, the dark red thermal shirt held a little warmth against his skin. He stretched slightly. After hours in the truck, his muscles felt tight, but ready, the way they always had after long transport flights before missions. Briggs jumped down beside him. The dog shook once, thick sable fur rippling from neck to tail, then stood alert at Kalen's left side. People noticed. It wasn't just the dog. It was the way the man and the dog moved together, quietly coordinated, like partners who had survived too many situations to waste energy on unnecessary signals. Kalen stepped into the hardware store. The bell above the door rang softly. The interior smelled like cedar planks, machine oil, and old coffee. Tools hung neatly along wooden walls, and stacks of work gloves and rope coils filled the center aisle. Behind the counter stood a man with broad shoulders and a thick gray beard that spread across his jaw like winter frost. He looked to be around 60. The man's eyes were calm and observant, the kind of eyes that had watched generations grow up in the same place. He wiped his hands on a cloth. "Afternoon," he said. His voice carried the slow confidence of someone who had never needed to raise it. Kalen nodded. "Afternoon." The man's gaze shifted briefly to Briggs. "Good dog." Briggs wagged his tail once, but stayed still. "Name's Harold Jensen," the man added. "Store's been mine 30 years. Kalen extended his hand. "Kalen Ward." The name caused a faint flicker in Harold's expression. He leaned back slightly. "Ward? From Alder Vale?" Word traveled fast in places like this. Kalen gave a small nod. "Just arrived." Harold scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well," he said slowly, "your grandfather fixed half the broken roofs in this town without ever sending a bill." He gestured toward the shelves. "Anything you need for that old house is on the back wall." The statement wasn't a sales pitch. It was a quiet acknowledgement. Kalen picked up a few basic supplies, nails, a hammer, a coil of rope. Tools felt familiar in his hands. Fixing something physical had always been easier than fixing anything else. Briggs remained beside him, nose occasionally brushing the floorboards, absorbing the new smells of town life. When they stepped back outside, the wind had shifted slightly. A gust carried the smell of lake water down the street. Kalen followed the scent with his eyes. Beyond the last row of buildings, the land rose gently toward a line of dark trees. Somewhere beyond that ridge was Alder Vale Manor. He drove the remaining mile slowly. The road narrowed into a gravel lane, flanked by tall pines whose branches formed a quiet arch overhead. Snow melted in narrow streams along the ditches, glinting like broken glass under the afternoon sun. Then the trees opened. Alder Vale appeared. The house stood on a small hill overlooking a frozen lake, its long wooden porch stretching across the front like open arms waiting for someone who had been gone too long. It was larger than Kalen remembered. The structure combined weathered timber and stone, built in a style that belonged to another era. The steep roof still held patches of snow, and several boards along the railing had warped under years of wind. But the house was standing. That mattered. Kalen parked near the old barn. Briggs jumped down first this time. The dog trotted across the yard, nose low, moving in wide circles as if scanning invisible lines across the ground. The yard had grown wild over the years. Tall grass lay flattened under winter's weight, and the wooden fence leaned tiredly in several places. Kalen walked up the porch steps slowly. Each board creaked under his boots. The front door was locked, but the key Daniel Keats had given him fit easily into the old brass lock. The door opened with a deep, tired sound. Inside, the air smelled like dust and wood smoke long faded into memory. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating floating particles that drifted lazily in the cold air. The living room looked almost exactly the same. Stone fireplace, long wooden table, bookshelves lining the walls. Time had settled here quietly, but respectfully. Kalen stepped forward. His boots echoed softly across the floorboards. Briggs entered behind him and paused just inside the doorway. The dog's body stiffened slightly. His nose lifted. He sniffed once, then twice, and slowly walked toward the far corner of the room. Briggs stopped beside the fireplace. He stared at the empty hearth for several seconds. Then, without warning, he sat down. Not the relaxed sit of a resting dog. A deliberate sit. The same command position he used during training exercises years ago. His eyes remained fixed on the fireplace. Kalen watched him. Something about the dog's stillness stirred an odd feeling in his chest. He stepped closer and looked at the stone hearth. Nothing unusual. Just ash stains and an old iron grate. But Briggs did not move. The dog's gaze held steady, as if the room itself had spoken in a language only he understood. After a long moment, Briggs finally looked back at Kalen. The expression in the dog's eyes wasn't excitement. It was recognition. Then the moment passed. Briggs stood, shook his fur lightly, and walked toward the back door. Kalen let out a slow breath. Still working, huh? He knelt briefly and ran his hand along the dog's neck. The thick fur was warm despite the cold air. Outside, the wind rustled the pine trees. For the next hour, Kalen moved through the house slowly. The kitchen cabinets were intact. The upstairs rooms needed cleaning, but nothing worse. The barn behind the house leaned slightly, but still held together. Standing on the back porch, he could see the frozen lake stretching across the valley like a sheet of steel. He remembered summers here. Fishing lines, mosquitoes buzzing in the evening. His grandfather sitting in a wooden chair with a coffee mug and telling stories about storms that had rolled across the lake before Kalen was born. The memories came back quietly, not painfully, just present. Briggs lay down beside the porch steps, watching the woods. The dog's tail thumped lightly when Kalen sat beside him. For the first time since opening the letter, Kalen didn't feel like he was drifting. He felt like he had arrived somewhere. Not permanently, not yet, but enough to breathe. The sun began to drop behind the trees, turning the snow along the lake into soft, silver light. Kalen leaned back against the porch railing. Briggs rested his head across Kalen's boot. The house behind them creaked gently as the temperature dropped. For the moment, Aldervale was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Morning arrived slowly over Aldervale. The cold light of early spring filtered through the tall pine trees surrounding the house, turning the frost along the porch railing into thin threads of silver. The lake below the hill was still mostly frozen, though a narrow band of dark water had begun to appear near the far shore. Somewhere in the forest, a woodpecker tapped against bark in steady rhythm. Kalen Ward stepped out onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The mug was chipped along the rim, something he had found in the kitchen cupboard the night before. It felt strangely familiar in his hand, though he couldn't remember exactly why. Memory sometimes worked that way, fragments returning before the whole story caught up. He leaned his shoulder against the wooden post at the edge of the porch. Briggs sat 2 steps below him. The German Shepherd looked fully awake already, ears forward, amber eyes scanning the trees. His sable coat caught the morning light, the cream and gray strands shifting gently when the breeze moved through them. The harness across his chest black with dark red trim looked slightly worn from years of work. Kalen took a sip of coffee and watched the quiet yard. "You ever get the feeling," he muttered, "that a place remembers you before you remember it?" Briggs flicked one ear. The dog's attention suddenly shifted toward the gravel lane leading down the hill. Kalen followed the movement with his eyes. Nothing yet, just wind brushing the grass. He finished his coffee and went back inside. The house needed work small things mostly. Loose hinges, cracked window seals, a sagging railing near the back porch. None of it was complicated. Kalen had always preferred problems that could be solved with tools rather than words. Within an hour he was outside again, hammer in hand, tightening boards along the porch steps. Briggs stayed nearby, occasionally wandering to the edge of the yard to sniff along the tree line. The quiet was interrupted by the distant rumble of an engine. A truck approached slowly along the gravel road. Kalen straightened and wiped his hands on his pants. The truck that rolled into the yard was an older Ford with rust creeping along the wheel wells. The driver stepped out and removed his hat. The man looked to be in his early 50s. He was tall, nearly Kalen's height, but broader through the shoulders, with the heavy build of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. His face was weathered, the skin around his eyes creased deeply from years of squinting against snow and sunlight. A thick mustache, streaked with gray, covered his upper lip. He wore a forest green ranger jacket and heavy boots dusted with dried mud. The man walked forward with calm confidence. "You must be Ward," he said. His voice carried the slow, grounded tone of someone used to giving instructions without raising it. Kalen nodded. "Kalen Ward." The man extended his hand. "Jonas Pike, Sheriff." His grip was firm, but not aggressive. Sheriff Jonas Pike studied Kalen for a moment longer than most people would. It wasn't hostility. It was evaluation. People who protected small towns learned to read strangers the way soldiers read terrain. Jonas glanced briefly toward Briggs. "That dog looks like he knows what he's doing." Briggs sat calmly beside Kalen's leg, watching the sheriff without tension. "Search and rescue training," Kalen replied. Jonas gave a low whistle. "Figures." The sheriff gestured toward the house behind them. "Haven't seen anyone living here in years," he said. "Your grandfather kept the place better than most folks keep their own." Kalen leaned lightly against the porch railing. "Seems solid enough." Jonas nodded once. "He built it that way." The sheriff removed his hat and ran a hand through short gray hair. "I'm not here to bother you," he said. "Just making introductions. Alder Ridge is small enough that we like to know who's around." His eyes moved toward the lake, then back to Kalen. "You planning to stay long?" The question carried more weight than it sounded like. Kalen considered his answer carefully. "Long enough to fix a few things." Jonas studied him again. Then he gave a small shrug. "Well," he said, placing his hat back on his head, "anyone willing to fix something instead of tear it down is already ahead of most." He nodded once more toward Briggs. "Good dog." With that, he returned to his truck and drove slowly back down the hill. The engine noise faded into the forest. Kalen watched the road for a moment after the sheriff disappeared. Briggs let out a quiet breath and stretched. "Friendly town," Kalen muttered. The dog wagged his tail once. Around noon, Kalen drove into town to buy more supplies. Alder Ridge looked slightly busier than the day before. A delivery truck sat outside the grocery store, and a few children rode bicycles carefully around puddles left by melting snow. The town library stood near the center of the street. The building was narrow but tall, made from old red brick that had darkened over decades of winter storms. A wooden sign hung above the door. Alder Ridge, Public Library. Kalen hesitated briefly before stepping inside. The interior smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Bookshelves stretched along both walls, and sunlight from tall windows painted long rectangles across the floor. Behind a desk near the entrance stood a woman arranging a stack of returned books. She looked up when the door opened. She was in her late 30s, perhaps 38 or 39, with a tall, slender frame and calm posture. Her hair light brown with faint golden tones was pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck. A few strands had escaped and framed her face. Her eyes were green, not bright green, but the muted shade of moss growing on old stone. She studied Kaelin quietly before speaking. "You must be the ward who just came back to Aldervale." Her voice was soft, but steady. Kaelin raised an eyebrow slightly. "News travels fast." The woman smiled faintly. "In small towns, it travels faster than the snow melts." She stepped around the desk and extended a hand. "Maeve Holloway." Her handshake was warm but firm, the grip of someone who valued sincerity over politeness. "I run the library here." Kaelin nodded. "Kaelin Ward." Maeve tilted her head slightly. "You look a lot like your grandfather," she said. The statement caught him off guard. "You knew him?" Maeve walked slowly back toward the desk. "Everyone did." She leaned against the edge of the table. "He helped a lot of people in this town," she continued. "Fixed roofs, loaned tools, sometimes just listened." Her eyes moved briefly toward the window. "He wasn't the kind of man who talked about it." Kaelin absorbed that quietly. He had always known his grandfather as a quiet man, but hearing how others saw him felt different. As Maeve spoke, Briggs suddenly stood up. The dog had been lying near the door, but now he walked slowly toward the center aisle of the library. His nose lifted slightly. He moved between two shelves, paused, then looked back toward Kaelin. Not anxious, just curious. Then Briggs walked over to a particular shelf and sat down. Directly in front of a small section labeled Local History. Maeve noticed it too. "That's unusual," she said. Kaelin walked over. Briggs stared at the shelf, as if waiting for something. Maeve reached out and pulled a book halfway from the row. The title read, Alder Ridge, Stories from the First Settlers. For a brief moment, the three of them stood in silence. Then Briggs relaxed, stood up, and wandered casually back toward the door, as if nothing had happened. The moment passed, but Kaelin felt something shift quietly in his chest. Maeve placed the book back on the shelf. "Your grandfather's name is in there," she said. Kaelin glanced at the book again, but didn't reach for it. "Maybe later." Maeve nodded, as if she understood that some memories arrived best when invited slowly. They spoke for a few more minutes about the town, the roads, and the weather. Then Kaelin stepped outside again with Briggs beside him. The afternoon sun hung low above the rooftops. Children laughed somewhere down the street. For the first time since arriving, Kaelin felt something unexpected settle in his chest. Not certainty, but possibility. He walked back to the truck. Briggs jumped into the passenger seat and looked out toward the road leading back to Aldervale. Kaelin started the engine. As they drove out of town, the wind across the lake carried the scent of melting ice. The house on the hill waited quietly for them, and for reasons Kaelin couldn't yet explain, the idea of leaving it someday felt a little less certain than it had yesterday. The road back to Aldervale curved along the edge of the lake like a quiet promise. By the time Kaelin reached the top of the hill again, the late afternoon sun had begun to sink behind the distant tree line, painting the snow in long bands of pale gold and blue. The house stood exactly where he had left it, silent, solid, watching. Kaelin parked the truck beside the old barn and stepped out into the cold air. The smell of pine mixed with the faint scent of thawing earth, a reminder that winter was loosening its grip one day at a time. Briggs jumped down beside him, landing lightly despite his size. The German shepherd stretched his back legs and shook his thick coat, then began trotting slowly around the yard, as if performing a routine inspection. Kaelin watched him with mild amusement. "You missed this place, didn't you?" Briggs didn't respond in any obvious way, but his tail lifted slightly, swaying with quiet confidence as he moved along the fence line. Kalen grabbed the toolbox from the truck bed and walked toward the barn. The structure leaned slightly to one side, its roof sagging in the middle where snow had accumulated over years of neglect. Still, the timber beams looked sturdy enough. With some work, it could hold again. He pushed open the sliding barn door. Dust rose in the air. Inside were the remnants of another era. A broken wagon wheel, coils of rope hanging from wooden pegs, old farming tools leaning in a corner. For a moment, Kalen stood there without moving. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice somewhere in the quiet. The past lingered in places like this, not as ghosts, but as echoes. Briggs wandered in behind him. The dog sniffed the floor carefully, then moved toward the far end of the barn, where the wooden boards met the earth. He paused. His head tilted slightly. Then he walked back outside. Kalen followed. The dog was already halfway across the yard now, heading toward the gravel lane that led down the hill. "Hey," Kalen called. Briggs ignored him. The dog's gait had changed. It wasn't wandering anymore, it was tracking. Kalen sighed and jogged after him. They reached the bottom of the hill just as an old pickup truck rattled along the road toward the property. Briggs slowed. The truck stopped beside the fence. The driver stepped out slowly, closing the door with a dull metallic thud. He was a large man in his early 60s, with shoulders that still carried the heavy shape of military training. His hair was mostly gray now, cut short, and his face bore the deep lines of someone who had spent long years outdoors. A faint scar ran from his left temple down toward his cheekbone. He wore a faded red flannel shirt beneath a canvas work jacket, and his boots were worn smooth from decades of walking rough ground. The man looked at Kalen first, then his eyes shifted to Briggs. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That dog yours?" he asked. His voice was gravelly but steady. Kalen nodded. "Yeah." The man leaned one elbow against the truck door. "Name's Jake Miller." He extended his hand. Kalen stepped forward and shook it. Jake's grip was firm, though his fingers carried the stiffness of old injuries. "Marine," Jake added simply. He said it the way soldiers did, with no need for explanation. Kalen understood immediately. "SEAL," he replied. Jake nodded once. No further clarification was necessary. Briggs approached cautiously and sniffed the man's jacket sleeve. Jake chuckled quietly. "He's checking my credentials." Briggs sat down beside him after a moment, satisfied. Jake looked up toward the house on the hill. "Haven't seen lights on up there in years," he said. Kalen glanced over his shoulder. "Just got here." Jake studied him briefly. "Figured that." The older man reached into the back of his truck and pulled out a small wooden crate. Inside was a dog. The animal was thin, its fur a patchwork of brown and black, ribs faintly visible beneath the coat. One front leg was wrapped in a makeshift bandage. The dog's eyes were wary but intelligent. "Name's Rusty," Jake said. "Caught his leg in an old trap last week." Rusty watched Kalen carefully, but didn't growl. Briggs stepped forward. The two dogs sniffed each other cautiously. Rusty seemed nervous at first, but Briggs lowered his head slightly, a calm, respectful posture dogs used to signal peace. Rusty relaxed. Jake scratched the back of his neck. "Figured maybe the old barn up there could shelter him while he heals." Kalen considered the request for only a moment. "That'll work." Jake nodded. "Appreciate it." The two men carried the crate up the hill together. Their pace matched naturally, the quiet rhythm of people used to walking long distances without unnecessary conversation. By the time they reached the barn again, the sun had dropped lower and the air had grown colder. Jake opened the crate. Rusty stepped out cautiously, testing his injured leg. Briggs stayed nearby, watching like a patient guard. Jake leaned against a wooden beam and looked around the barn. "Place has good bones," he said. "Needs work, though." Kalen wiped dust from his hands. "Working on it." Jake nodded slowly. "Your grandfather used to let people stay here sometimes," he said. The comment caught Kalen off guard. "Yeah?" Jake's gaze drifted toward the open barn door. "Veterans mostly," he shrugged. "Men who came back from places they didn't quite leave." Kalen didn't answer. The statement hung in the air between them. Rusty suddenly let out a quiet whine. Both men turned. The injured dog had limped a few steps across the barn floor and stopped near a wooden post. Briggs walked over and sat beside him. Not guarding, not challenging, simply sitting there. The two dogs remained perfectly still for several seconds. Then Rusty lowered himself slowly onto the straw-covered floor and rested his head beside Briggs's paw. Jake watched the scene with an expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "That's something," he murmured. Kalen didn't say anything, but something about the quiet trust between the two animals stirred an unexpected warmth in his chest. Jake stayed another hour. They patched the broken fence behind the barn and reinforced a loose beam inside. As they worked, Jake spoke occasionally about the town. Not gossip, just facts. Which families had lived there longest? Which farms had closed? Which winters had been the hardest? The kind of quiet history that never appeared in books. Eventually, Jake packed his tools back into his truck. Before leaving, he glanced once more toward the house. "You planning to stay?" he asked. Kalen shrugged slightly. "Not sure yet." Jake nodded slowly. "Well," he said, climbing into the driver's seat, "sometimes a place figures that out before you do." The truck rattled down the hill and disappeared along the road. Evening settled over Aldervale. The sky turned deep blue, and the first stars began to appear above the dark forest. Kalen stood outside the barn for a long moment. Rusty lay sleeping on the straw. Briggs sat nearby, watching the door. The old house behind them creaked softly as the temperature dropped. For the first time since arriving, the property didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. Not just by people, but by purpose. Kalen walked slowly back toward the porch. Briggs followed beside him, his steady footsteps echoing quietly across the frozen ground. Inside the house, the lamps would soon be lit, and though Kalen didn't yet understand why, the thought of that simple light waiting in the windows felt strangely important. Morning came to Aldervale, with a pale sky and a thin layer of frost over the grass. The night had been colder than Kalen expected, and the ground near the barn crackled under his boots as he stepped outside. He paused on the porch and drew in a long breath. The air tasted sharp and clean, carrying the smell of pine, frozen earth, and the faint mineral scent drifting up from the lake. Somewhere across the water, a lone bird called, its cry echoing faintly against the tree line. Briggs was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the fence, body still and alert, as he watched Rusty slowly hobble around the barnyard. The injured dog's leg had improved slightly overnight. The makeshift bandage Jake had wrapped remained snug, though Rusty still favored the limb carefully with each step. Rusty's coat, brown with darker patches along the back, looked less dull in the daylight. He moved cautiously, pausing often to glance toward the woods, as though years of survival had taught him not to trust open spaces. Briggs followed a few feet behind him. Not pushing, not crowding, just keeping watch. Kalen leaned against the porch railing. The quiet routine of the morning had an unexpected rhythm to it. Coffee, repairs, checking the barn. It wasn't the life he had planned when he left the military, But it wasn't empty either. He stepped down into the yard and crossed toward the barn, carrying a toolbox under one arm. Inside, Rusty had settled onto a pile of straw, while Briggs lay nearby like a silent sentinel. "Looking better," Kalen murmured. Rusty lifted his head slightly. His eyes, dark and wary, watched Kalen carefully, but without fear. Outside, the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the calm. Kalen straightened. Another vehicle approached the property. It wasn't Jake's truck this time. The car that rolled up the lane was newer, sleek, black, and polished enough to look out of place on the muddy rural road. It stopped near the house. The driver stepped out. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with straight blonde hair combed neatly back, and a long, dark coat that hung almost perfectly against his frame. His posture was upright, almost elegant, like someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than barnyards. When he removed his sunglasses, his eyes revealed a sharp intelligence, cold but attentive. The man walked toward the porch with confident steps. "Mr. Ward," he called. His voice carried clearly across the yard. Kalen approached slowly. "Depends who's asking." The man smiled faintly. "Vernon Slate." He extended a hand. His grip was firm but controlled, the practiced handshake of a businessman who measured people the moment he met them. "I represent North Point Development." Kalen said nothing. Vernon glanced briefly toward the barn, where Briggs and Rusty watched from the doorway. "A beautiful property you have here," Vernon continued. His eyes moved across the house, the land, the distant lake. "There aren't many places like this left." Kalen folded his arms. "What do you want?" Vernon's smile widened slightly. "Direct. I like that." He reached into his coat and pulled out a slim folder. "We've been surveying land around Alder Ridge for a new resort development, a quiet, high-end retreat along the lake." He opened the folder and handed Kalen a sheet of paper. The number printed near the bottom made Kalen pause. It was more money than he had expected. A lot more. Vernon watched his reaction carefully. "Your house sits on the best piece of land in the valley," he said calmly. "The view alone is worth the investment." He slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "We'd like to purchase Alder Vale." For a moment the wind moved through the yard in silence. Briggs stepped forward from the barn and sat beside Kalen. Rusty remained inside, watching cautiously. Kalen glanced again at the number on the paper. It could pay off every debt he had. It could buy a smaller place somewhere warmer. A simpler life. No repairs, no responsibility. Vernon spoke again. "You could walk away with nearly $800,000. The figure hung in the cold air like something heavy. "Most people would consider that a good day." Before Kalen could answer, Briggs suddenly stood up. The dog's body stiffened. His ears tilted forward. Briggs walked slowly toward Vernon. The businessman froze for a second as the large German shepherd approached. Briggs stopped just inches from him. Then he sniffed the air carefully around Vernon's coat. Once. Twice. The dog's nose wrinkled slightly. Then Briggs stepped back and sat down again beside Kalen. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. But the calm certainty in his posture carried a message. Kalen didn't know exactly what the dog had sensed, yet something about Briggs's quiet disapproval made the offer feel different. Vernon cleared his throat softly. "Well-trained dog?" Kalen folded the paper slowly and handed it back. "I haven't decided anything." Vernon nodded. "Of course." He closed the folder again. "No rush." The businessman took a few steps toward the porch, studying the house more closely. "This place has history," he said thoughtfully. "But history doesn't always pay the bills." He looked back at Kalen. "Take a few days to think about it." Vernon returned to his car. The engine started smoothly, and within moments the vehicle rolled back down the gravel road. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Briggs remained beside Kalen, watching the road long after the car disappeared. Kalen exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered. "That's new." He walked back toward the barn. Rusty lifted his head as they entered. The injured dog wagged his tail once when Briggs approached. Kalen sat down on an overturned bucket and stared at the open barn door. $800,000. The number echoed in his thoughts. For a man who had spent most of his life moving from one mission to the next without worrying about property or savings, the amount felt surreal. It could solve a lot of problems. But as he looked around the barn, the beams Jake had helped reinforce, the straw Rusty now slept on, the quiet presence of Briggs nearby, another thought surfaced. Selling the house wouldn't just mean leaving. It would mean erasing everything this place could become. The sound of an engine returned in the distance. Jake's old truck appeared again near sunset. The Marine stepped out and glanced toward the barn. "Everything still standing?" he asked. Kalen nodded. "Mostly?" Jake noticed the tension in his posture. "Something happen?" Kalen held up the folded paper Vernon had left behind. "Offer to buy the place." Jake took the paper and studied it carefully. He let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of money." Kalen didn't respond. Jake handed the paper back. "Question is," the older man said quietly, "what's it worth to you?" The sun dipped below the trees. Long shadows stretched across the yard. Inside the barn, Rusty shifted slightly in the straw, while Briggs lay beside him. The two dogs looked comfortable in the fading light. For the first time since Vernon's visit, Kalen realized something important. This place wasn't empty anymore, and that made the decision a lot harder. The wind arrived before the snow. It came down from the mountains sometime before dawn, sliding through the pine forest with a low, restless sound that pressed gently against the walls of Alder Vale. Kalen Ward woke before the first light touched the windows. For a moment, he lay still, listening. The old house had a language of its own, small creaks, from wooden beams shifting in the cold, the quiet hum of the stove, cooling from the night before, the faint tapping of branches brushing the roof. It felt alive. Not in a strange or supernatural way, but in the way old places often do when someone finally returns to them. Briggs lifted his head from the rug beside the bed. The German Shepherd blinked slowly, his amber eyes adjusting to the gray light creeping through the curtains. "You heard it too," Kalen murmured. Briggs stood, stretched his back legs, and padded quietly toward the door. By the time Kalen stepped outside, the sky had already begun to brighten with a pale blue glow. The ground was frozen again. Rusty was awake in the barnyard, moving more confidently now. The injured dog still favored his leg slightly, but the stiffness from earlier days had begun to ease. Briggs trotted toward him. Rusty wagged his tail in greeting. Kalen leaned against the fence for a moment and watched the two dogs circle each other slowly before settling near the barn door. Something about their quiet companionship made the property feel less empty. He poured fresh water into the metal bowl beside the barn and checked Rusty's bandage. "Almost healed," he said softly. Rusty looked up with cautious gratitude in his dark eyes. Footsteps crunched across the gravel behind him. Kalen turned. Jake Miller was already halfway up the path from the road. The older Marine moved with the steady gait of someone who had spent decades adapting to old injuries. The cold morning air turned his breath into thin clouds as he approached. "Morning," Jake said. He carried a thermos under one arm. Kalen nodded. "Morning." Jake poured coffee into 2 metal cups and handed one over. Neither man spoke for a while. They stood by the fence, watching the rising sun creep slowly over the hills. After several minutes, Jake finally said, Still thinking about that offer? Kalen stared across the frozen lake. Hard not to. Jake nodded slowly. That kind of money changes things. He sipped his coffee. But it doesn't always make them better. The words hung quietly in the air. Kalen looked down at Briggs. The dog sat beside him calmly, gaze scanning the forest as if reading a map only he could see. I didn't come here planning to stay, Kalen admitted. Jake shrugged. Most people who end up staying somewhere didn't plan it either. The older Marine clapped him lightly on the shoulder. Well, he said, I'll be around if you need help fixing that roof before the next snow. Jake headed back toward his truck. The rumble of the engine faded down the road. Later that morning, Kalen drove into town. Alder Ridge looked brighter than usual. The sun reflected off melting patches of ice along the street, turning the puddles into scattered mirrors. He stopped near the grocery store. Inside, the warm smell of baked bread and coffee filled the air. Behind the counter stood a man Kalen hadn't seen before. He was short, but solidly built, perhaps in his early 40s, with thick black hair tied into a loose ponytail at the back of his neck. A trimmed beard framed his square jaw, and his dark eyes carried the relaxed confidence of someone who had learned to handle both business and people. When Kalen stepped inside, the man wiped his hands on a towel and smiled. You must be the new guy up at Aldervale. His voice carried a friendly rasp. Name's Miguel Alvarez. He gestured toward the shelves. I run the store now. Took it over from my uncle last year. Kalen nodded. Kalen Ward. Miguel's handshake was warm and firm. You military? Miguel asked. Kalen hesitated briefly. Used to be. Miguel grinned. Figured. He nodded toward Briggs, who sat calmly beside Kalen's leg. That dog walks like a soldier. Briggs lifted his head slightly, acknowledging the compliment. Kalen gathered a few supplies, nails, canned food, bandages for Rusty. Miguel packed everything into a paper bag. You settling in okay out there? Miguel asked. Working on it. Miguel leaned against the counter. That house meant a lot to people around here. Kalen looked up. How so? Miguel shrugged. My uncle used to say your grandfather helped half this town when they needed it. He smiled faintly. Guess the place had a reputation? As Kalen stepped outside the store, Briggs suddenly stopped. The dog's ears twitched. He turned slowly toward the far end of the street. There, near the old bus stop bench, sat a young boy. The child couldn't have been older than 10. He wore a faded green jacket several sizes too large and held a small cardboard box on his lap. Inside the box was a kitten. The animal was tiny, gray and white, its fur matted and its eyes barely open. The boy looked uncertain, glancing up each time someone passed. Briggs walked toward him without hesitation. Kalen followed. The boy stiffened slightly when the large German shepherd approached. But Briggs lowered his head gently and sniffed the edge of the cardboard box. The kitten let out a weak squeak. The boy blinked. Your dog's nice, he said quietly. His voice carried the nervous honesty of someone unused to speaking to strangers. Kalen crouched down. Where'd you find the kitten? The boy shrugged. Behind the diner? He looked down at the animal. Mom says we can't keep it. Briggs sat beside the boy and wagged his tail slowly. For a moment, the three of them remained there in silence. Something about the scene. Small, fragile, unexpected, stirred a quiet thought in Kalen's mind. The barn at Aldervale suddenly seemed a little larger than he remembered. By the time Kalen returned to the house that afternoon, the sky had begun to cloud over again. The wind carried the promise of another snowstorm. Rusty limped out to greet them when the truck door opened. Briggs jumped down first, trotting toward the barn. Inside, the kitten's small box was placed carefully near a pile of straw. Rusty sniffed the new arrival cautiously. The kitten squeaked again. Briggs lay down nearby. The barn, once empty, now held 3 animals resting in the fading light. Kalen stood in the doorway watching them. A strange realization crept into his thoughts. This place wasn't just shelter anymore. It was beginning to gather the lost. And for the first time since Vernon Slate had handed him that offer, the idea of selling Alder Vale felt heavier than the number printed on the page. Outside, snow began to fall again. Snow fell through the night. By morning, Alder Vale looked softer than it had in weeks. The storm had not been violent, just a steady curtain of white drifting quietly across the valley. Pine branches bowed under its weight, and the frozen lake below the hill wore a thin veil of fresh powder that glittered beneath the pale sun. Kalen Ward stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands. The air was colder than the day before, but it carried the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the valley. Behind him, the house creaked gently as the heat from the stove pushed back against the morning frost. Briggs sat beside the door, his sable coat thick against the cold. The German shepherd watched the yard with the calm focus he always carried, ears forward, posture steady, every movement deliberate. The barn door stood slightly open. Inside, Rusty lay curled on a bed of straw near the wall. The kitten, no longer hidden inside the cardboard box, had climbed onto Rusty's side during the night. The tiny gray and white creature slept soundly against the larger dog's ribs, its small paws kneading occasionally, as if dreaming. Briggs glanced toward them, then back at Kalen. The scene looked simple, but it meant something. A week earlier, the barn had been empty. Now it held life. Kalen sipped his coffee slowly and leaned his shoulder against the porch beam. He could still see the folded document from Vernon Slate sitting on the kitchen table inside. $800,000. Enough to start a new life somewhere else. Somewhere easier. But the thought felt different now. He didn't quite know why. Late that morning, a truck climbed the hill. Jake Miller stepped out first, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind. Behind him came Sheriff Jonas Pike in his dark ranger coat. The 2 men walked toward the porch together. "Morning," Jake called. Kalen nodded. "Morning." Sheriff Pike removed his hat briefly. "Figured we'd stop by." The sheriff's voice carried its usual calm authority. "We heard North Point's been making offers around town." Kalen gestured toward the porch railing. "They came yesterday." Jake whistled softly. "Didn't waste time." Sheriff Pike studied Kalen's face carefully. "Company's been sniffing around this valley for months," he said. "They want that lake view." The sheriff's weathered eyes drifted toward the barn. Rusty had stepped outside, limping less noticeably now. The kitten followed him a few clumsy steps before sitting down in the snow, confused by the cold. Jake chuckled. "Looks like the barn's getting crowded." Kalen shrugged. "Seems that way." Sheriff Pike leaned against the porch railing. "Town's small," he said. "People notice when something changes." His gaze moved toward the house. "Your grandfather used to say this place had a way of finding people who needed it." The comment lingered quietly in the air. Kalen looked down toward Briggs. The dog remained still, watching the valley road. Suddenly Briggs stood, not alarmed, just alert. The German shepherd walked slowly toward the edge of the porch and looked out across the snow-covered field. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, a figure appeared at the bottom of the hill. A man trudged slowly up the path. His coat was thin and worn, and the way he walked suggested exhaustion rather than purpose. He was younger than Jake, but older than Kalen, perhaps in his early 40s. His beard had grown uneven and rough, and his hair hung loose beneath a knit cap pulled low over his ears. When he reached the fence, he stopped, uncertain. Jake straightened. Sheriff Pike narrowed his eyes. The stranger raised one hand slightly. "I heard there might be work here," he said. His voice sounded tired but sincere. Briggs stepped down from the porch and approached him. The dog circled once, sniffing carefully. Then Briggs sat beside the man. No growl, no warning, just quiet acceptance. Sheriff Pike glanced at Kalen. "Well," he muttered, "that answers one question." Kalen walked down the steps. The stranger introduced himself as Daniel Hartley. He had the lean frame of someone who had once been strong, but had lost weight over time. His face carried the deep lines of sleepless nights and long roads. "I used to do construction," Daniel explained. "Roofing mostly." His eyes flicked briefly toward the barn, then toward the house. "Jake said someone might need help fixing things." Jake shrugged slightly. "Mentioned it at the diner." Daniel nodded awkwardly. "I don't need much. Just somewhere to work for a while." Kalen studied him quietly. Something about the man reminded him of soldiers he had known after deployments, people who looked functional on the outside but carried unseen fractures inside. Briggs remained beside Daniel, tail resting calmly in the snow. The dog seemed satisfied. Kalen nodded toward the barn. "Roof could use another pair of hands." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Thank you." By afternoon, the three men were working together. Jake handled the heavy beams while Daniel climbed carefully along the barn roof, securing new planks where snow had loosened the old ones. Kalen worked between them, hammer in hand. The rhythm of the work felt familiar. Wood, nails, cold air, quiet concentration. Below them, Rusty lay near the barn door while the kitten batted lazily at falling snowflakes. Briggs watched the yard. Every now and then, he glanced up toward the roof, as if supervising the entire operation. Sheriff Pike had left earlier, but returned near sunset. He leaned against his truck, watching the progress. "Not bad," he said. Daniel climbed down carefully and wiped sweat from his brow. Jake slapped the younger man lightly on the shoulder. "Roof might actually survive the winter now." Kalen stepped back to examine the work. For the first time, the barn looked stable, complete. Snow clouds began gathering again along the horizon. Sheriff Pike walked up the hill toward the porch. "So," he said calmly, "you planning to call North Point back?" Kalen wiped his hands on a rag. He looked around the property. The repaired barn. Rusty resting in the straw. The kitten curled against his side. Daniel stacking leftover lumber. Jake standing beside the truck with the quiet patience of someone who had seen enough life not to rush decisions. And Briggs. The German Shepherd stood in the center of the yard, watching all of it like a silent witness. Kalen finally spoke. "I'm not selling." The words came out quietly, but they carried weight. Jake smiled faintly. Sheriff Pike nodded once, satisfied. "Thought you might say that." Snow began to fall again as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Inside the house, warm light soon glowed through the windows. Outside the barn door creaked softly in the wind. Aldervale no longer felt like an abandoned inheritance. It felt like something alive, something worth staying for. Before this story ends, there is one quiet truth worth remembering. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as lightning or loud victories. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a place that refuses to give up on us, in a loyal dog who stays when the world walks away, in strangers who become family, and in the small choices that slowly rebuild a life. Kalen thought he had inherited only an old house, but what he truly inherited was something far greater, a chance to become the kind of person his grandfather believed he could be. And perhaps that is how God often works, not through grand signs in the sky, but through simple moments. A door that opens when we feel lost, a path that appears when we are ready to stop running, a place that reminds us who we were meant to be. In our everyday lives, we all face moments like this, moments where we can walk away, or choose to stay and build something that matters. Maybe the miracle is not the place. Maybe the miracle is the heart that learns to care again. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or what part of the story stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, courage, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. May God watch over you and your family. May He guide your steps when the road is uncertain, and may He fill your life with quiet miracles you might not notice at first, but will one day realize were there all along.